Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. Welcome back to the Divine Reality course. We're continuing with the section on the problem of evil and suffering, and we're highlighting how this problem isn't really a problem for Islam. Now, brothers and sisters, we're going to move on to addressing the first two assumptions of the three assumptions we highlighted last time that are just made when formulating this particular argument against religion and in particular Islam. So the first two assumptions, let me just highlight them again. Number one, that God is only wholly good, all-knowing and all-powerful, and restricting God to this definition. And number two, the false assumption, or falsely assuming that they have the ability to comprehend God's knowledge and wisdom. Okay? So essentially this is misrepresenting the Islamic conception. This is a straw man, right? This is what you can refer to as a straw man fallacy. What it does is it abstracts God's goodness and power away from God's names and attributes. And we do not do that from an Islamic perspective. There are other names and attributes such as the wise, al-Hakim, and so on and so forth. And from the perspective of Islamic theology, we're to understand all of God's names and attributes via His oneness. There is no abstraction. So we don't abstract Allah's power, His knowledge, and his some of His other attributes from all of His other attributes. We recognize that Allah is, He is all powerful, He is all knowing, and He is also the all wise, right? So you can't separate these. And sometimes for most atheists, like I've mentioned, they probably don't even realize they're doing this because they're just not aware of our conception of God, who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. They're just not aware. They may just take a general Christian theistic conception of God, which is God is all powerful, all knowing, or loving, and then superimpose that upon us. And this is what you refer to as a straw man fallacy, right? They're straw manning our position. So it's good to highlight this whenever you're discussing the problem of evil. Look, that we believe Allah has many names and attributes, and yes, He is all powerful, yes, He is all knowing, but at the same time, He is also the all wise. And therefore, when hardships happen, trials happen, we go through difficulties, we suffer, when evil takes place, we shouldn't assume that there is no wisdom behind it. There is more than a possibility from the Islamic perspective. We know that there's wisdom behind everything that takes place. And therefore that deconstructs the problem of evil. Now they may turn around and say, well, you're making that argument that God is, it's in the wisdom of God, it's beyond us. Yes, but this is an extremely logical point. That we're not just saying it and just making it up. We are basing this off of our theology. We know Allah is al-Hakim. Therefore, there is wisdom behind things that take place. And we also know, and this again is a logical point, that we are not like God. We are different from God. God is God, we are humans. There is nothing like God, especially from the Islamic perspective. Laysa kamithlihi shay. He has no kufu. There is no equal in any way, shape or form. So, therefore we shouldn't put ourselves in the position where we assume, and this ties in with the second assumption, that we somehow have the ability to know everything, the entire picture, that we can understand the wisdom behind everything, or we should be able to understand the wisdom behind everything. We can't. Now, just because we can't understand the wisdom behind the evil and suffering that takes place, it doesn't mean that there is no wisdom there. And if anyone turns around and says, oh, just because I can't see the wisdom, therefore there is no wisdom, this is egocentrism, and this is arrogance and as well, ignorance and arrogance. It's the ego. Basically, they what they're saying, in other words, is, or they're assuming that I have the ability to understand everything. I have the ability to understand or pick up on any wisdom that may be there. I have the capacity to do that. And because I haven't seen it, there isn't any wisdom there. No, this is false. We don't as human beings. We are limited human beings living through or experiencing serial time. We don't have access to the future, right? We don't have access to the past anymore. We are just here in the present. Allah has past, present, future. He has access to all. He's not bound by these things, right? And therefore, how can you compare God's knowledge with human knowledge? You can't. And many times this happens in our own life. Something happens in our life, something disastrous, something goes wrong. We can't make sense of it in the moment. It just doesn't make any sense to us. However, maybe sometimes, and it's happened, I'm sure it's happened to you, it's happened to me, happens to all of us, 6 months later, 7 months later, a year later, we look back, and 7 months later or a year later, we're like, oh my God, if that didn't happen to me, that disaster didn't take place in my life, I wouldn't be where I am today. Right? And then we can appreciate it. Why does this happen? I want us to really think about this for a second. Why is it that in the moment we couldn't appreciate the wisdom, but sometimes a year later, 6 months later, we can appreciate the wisdom behind it, or aspects of the wisdom behind it? It's because now we have traversed time. You know, we've moved forward. We are now in the future as compared to the time that the trial took place. And therefore we have much more information and knowledge. And therefore we can now connect the dots in a better way. Right? We have the ability now to connect the dots in the more correct way, if you like, in a more meaningful way. Whereas in the moment, in that event, at the time, we couldn't do that because we didn't have access to all of the knowledge. We didn't know how this trial is eventually going to lead to something good. We couldn't see it because we couldn't see the future. But now, because we've traversed time and we're 6 months later, a year later, now we can, right? So again, it just boils down to the point. As human beings, we are limited. Our knowledge is limited. Our ability to seek out and understand the wisdom behind things is limited. And therefore, just because we don't have the capacity to appreciate the wisdom behind things, it doesn't logically follow that there is no wisdom there. And if we argue that there is no wisdom there, that's just arguing from the ego. It's egocentrism. And we'll maybe touch upon that in a second again. If God is the wise, there is wisdom behind the perceived evil. It's as simple as that, right? Now, just want to make a side point here as well, that we're discussing this problem of evil and suffering on a very sort of logical basis. People suffer. Human beings suffer. We all go through hardships and trials and tribulations, right? And they are difficult, even for the Muslims. Even though we can conceptualize this and understand this and know that there is good behind things and that there is a greater wisdom behind these things, and inevitably at the end of the day it's all good, still we feel the pain. We're human at the end of the day, right? So we have to be very sensitive when we're addressing this argument, because it can be the case, and probably is in most cases, that these atheists that are presenting this argument, they have probably gone through something really difficult in their life, a hardship, a trial, a tribulation, a loss. So therefore we shouldn't be insensitive. We should have the emotional intelligence. So although we're logically dismantling this argument, we should still be empathetic and get them, highlight to them that, look, although we're discussing this on a logical level and we can conceptualize this and make sense of this, yet we still, on a human level, we still are emotional beings. We feel the pain. We suffer, and it's difficult, and we don't wish suffering upon anyone, even though we may understand the good in it. We always pray to God to make things easy for us and to remove trials and tribulations. And we can relate to you. So you want to do that. You want to make sure you're quite sensitive as you're addressing this argument, and you don't become insensitive, because what tends to happen whenever we're engaging in logical philosophical arguments, this type of engagement, it can be very dry. So you don't want to be completely insensitive and get carried away, to someone's being insensitive to someone's emotions and get carried away in the logic. Always, empathize with them and make it as human as you can, this discussion, inshallah. So what wisdom? We've touched upon this, we'll reiterate this point. Like I said, this is arguing from ignorance. Just because the wisdom cannot be seen or understood, it doesn't mean there is no wisdom. This is a completely valid and logical point. And it's not a cop-out. We refer to and submit to unknown wisdom reasons all the time. And this is another point that we should appreciate. That look, we as human beings, we refer to and submit to unknown wisdom all the time in our lives. Right? When you're sick and you have, say, a fever, and your fever is not getting better, who do you go to? Who would go to a baker? Who would go to the mechanic? None of us. As rational, intelligent human beings, we would go to the authority, the doctor, right? Now, when we go to the doctor, brothers and sisters, what do? Right? Do we tell the doctor our symptoms? He writes us a prescription. Do we take the prescription? Go to the chemist, buy the medicine, take the medicine. Or when we go to the doctor, you tell him your symptoms, he writes you a prescription, and instead of taking the prescription and taking the medicine, you put your feet up on the table, and do you start arguing with the doctor saying, no, I don't want this? Do you rip up the prescription and throw it in his face and say, no, give me this instead? No. We submit to the wisdom of the doctor. We don't have to understand the mechanisms of how the medicine works. what specific medicine it is, what plants it's derived from, how it's manufactured. We don't worry about these things. We submit to the wisdom of the doctor. And we do this throughout our lives, right? So this is very similar. We know who Allah is. If Allah is all wise, He's all knowing. We are not. Therefore, if something happens and we don't understand the wisdom behind it, we submit to Allah. We don't challenge God and say, no, God, I'm not going to be okay with this until I understand the wisdom behind this. No, we don't do this. And even if we were able to understand, hypothetically speaking, Allah gave us the ability to understand the wisdom, the breakdown of every single, aspect of that wisdom behind a specific event of suffering. How would that help us in the grand scheme of things? Probably won't, right? Because what is our objective as human beings? We were created to know Allah and worship Him. We were not created to know like Allah and understand the wisdom behind everything like God. No, of course not. So that is not our objective as human beings anyway, to understand the entirety of the wisdom and knowledge behind everything. No, our objective is to use the faculties God has given us, the capacity He's given us, to be able to help us submit to and worship Allah. So from an Islamic perspective, when we suffer, we go through something difficult, even if we don't understand the wisdom behind it, the intricacies of why this is happening or what potential good is in this, what we do as Muslims is we submit to Allah. We remain patient. It's an opportunity for us to exercise certain virtues, lost virtues, such as patience. We turn to Allah. We worship Him more. We pray to Him. And praying to Allah and asking Allah for help and assistance is a form of worship. Again, fulfilling the purpose of our lives. Right? So that's how we should react in these situations. But obviously from a non-Muslim perspective, they're not going to appreciate these things, at least not in that moment, until they are taught these things, inshallah. So, in a nutshell, just because you cannot see the wisdom, it doesn't mean there is no wisdom there. We have epistemic limitations. God's wisdom and knowledge is maximally perfect. Right? Allah is the most perfect being. His names and attributes are perfect, without deficiency, without flaw. We have epistemic limitations. We cannot know everything or comprehend all the reasons. As I've been just hammering the point over and over again, we have to understand the distinction between us and Allah. One of the reasons this problem arises is because in the 21st century we have this God complex. We think we are more than we are on some levels, that we can understand everything, or we should be able to understand everything, or even if we can't, that God should tell us the wisdom behind everything. Who are we? I mean, it's a very arrogant position. The things that fuel the problem of evil and suffering, this argument, a lot of it's arrogance. That I should be able to know, I should be able to understand the wisdom. God should tell me. It's His duty to tell me. No, it isn't. We've forgotten who we are in relation to our Creator. So we have to remember this. And Islam does this in a beautiful way. Allah reminds us of who we are and who our Creator is and what our relationship with Allah is. And what our etiquettes should be with our Creator and how we should humble ourselves. And if we can keep all of these things in place, again, from an Islamic perspective, the problem, quote unquote, problem of evil and suffering melts away completely. So it's fallacious to assume that we have the full picture, right? So it's, again, at the moment here, we're making the distinction. To be able to make the distinction between who we are and understand our limitations as human beings and who Allah is and His perfect names and attributes, to comprehend this reality goes a long way in tackling the problem of evil and suffering, at the very least for the Muslims. So we can now face these things in a better way with the right mindset, inshallah. So brothers and sisters, in the next session, we're going to be looking at one of my favorite stories from the Quran, and how again it just completely dismantles and breaks down the problem of evil and suffering. And that is the story of Musa and Khidr. So if you want to do some homework, I would encourage you guys to go and read the story of Musa alayhi salam and Khidr and reflect upon it, because it will really help us in tackling the problem of evil and suffering and engage in the next session. So when you're ready, move on to the next session.